Hi, my name is Nina Shmansik, and this is my favorite brain part. So, I bet you're wondering, what is my favorite brain part? It is the prefrontal cortex, and I'm going to tell you why. So, what is the prefrontal cortex? So, to me, the prefrontal cortex is the most powerful part of the brain. So, it has three main regions of it. So, I'm going to tell you about those. There is the orbitofrontal prefrontal cortex, which deals with social behavior and decision making, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which controls our consciousness, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is monitoring out perception and your emotional expression. So, it depends a lot on what makes you human. What makes it so important? So, the prefrontal cortex, which is also called the management system of the brain, carries out executive function. So, executive function controls your working memory, cognitive flexibility, and your self control. So, these are skills like paying attention, regulating emotion, self monitoring, and organizing. So, this is incredibly important to making you function properly in society, which is really interesting because it carries out such an important role with your emotions and your executive function. So, that's why I think it's so powerful. So why is it so cool? So this is going to get a little odd because of the things I think that are cool, but I'll get into it. So let's start with Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage survived a large iron rod penetrating his skull, and he suffered injuries to the prefrontal cortex. After his accident, he had a dramatic change in his personality, and he was the first person to show that personality functioned through the front parts of your brain. So what was so interesting about this to me is the fact that you are able to completely obliterate, essentially, your prefrontal cortex and still be able to function as a human. But the part that is incredibly interesting is the fact that you essentially become a different person. You have a lot of changes in your personality. Phineas Gage specifically was said to have become a little bit more hostile. He didn't have as much impulse control. So basically, you can be deemed healthy, but you have your essential entire body is changing. So another reason why this is so interesting to me is the lobotomy. So I don't think that the lobotomy is interesting, but I think that the prefrontal cortex in it is interesting. So the lobotomy is a neurosurgery performed by severing the connections of the prefrontal cortex to the rest of your brain. Again, the fact that you were able to function as you have part of your brain severed is incredibly interesting. But candidates for the surgery were often struggling with mental illness or what was deemed mental illness back in the day. And post-surgery patients often had issues functioning independently and showed a detached personality with an inability to feel emotion. So this is now seen unethical because it was used to restrain individual rights. As people had finished these lobotomies, they would then become sort of mindless zombies, which is, again, fascinating as to how the prefrontal cortex works because they were deemed healthy and they were deemed better, but they lost large parts of themselves. So this is where it gets a little odd, but murderers. I'm very interested in true crime. So when I read that the prefrontal cortex controls aggression, concentration, and regulates impulse control, I said there has to be a tie back to murderers. So I found a study done by criminologist Dr. Adrian Raine, and it scanned 40 convicted killers' brains, and he found lower activity in the prefrontal cortex in all of their brains compared to someone who was normal. And that was really interesting because he is claiming that the prefrontal cortex deficiency combined with a poor background can create a criminal. So another reason that that's really interesting is the prefrontal cortex controls a lot of your guilt feelings and your ability to feel remorse. So it would make sense that you would have a lower function in your prefrontal cortex because if you were a killer, because then you wouldn't feel as much remorse. So that was an interesting thing that I figured out. Well, I didn't figure out, but I read it. And then this made me think about the nature versus nurture argument. Being in a psychobiology class, I'm obviously interested in both psychology and biology and the way that they connect. So the nature versus nurture debate is the debate on if human behavior is innate or if it's learned. And the prefrontal cortex plays a huge role in your behavior, as we talked about earlier, and is often used in that nature argument. So the brain doesn't develop until you're about 25 years old, or at least the prefrontal cortex is typically one of the last parts of your brain to develop. And so that plays a huge role in the nature versus nurture doc because all of the things that are done when you're a teenager, bad behavior, things like that, they're not done because of the prefrontal cortex isn't fully formed. But I think personally it's really interesting. It's a great combination because the prefrontal cortex in the way that you are born is a way that you're going to function, but also obviously the behavior, the way that you're treated as a child and all of those things also play a role in how your brain successfully forms. So to move on from that, I just think that the prefrontal cortex is an incredibly complex part of your brain, and it carries out a lot of the functions. The part of it that's most interesting to me is the fact that it's essentially what makes you human. Without your prefrontal cortex, as we've seen, or the way that it works properly, there's a lot of issues with your personality. And I just think that it's a really fascinating part of the brain because of how important it is in making you human. So that's my favorite part of the brain.